Room time down there at the Intercontinental Hotel in Sydney this morning.
Proximity to George Bush won't help the PM, according to Nine's political guru Laurie Oakes.
Largely because of Iraq, Mr Bush is frequently described in America as a lame duck president. If Newspoll is right, he could be flying in tonight to meet a dead duck Prime Minister.
At The Australian, columnist Mark Day was charting how his newspaper had reached a watershed on John Howard with its relatively critical assessment of the Prime Minister's 11 years in office.
Coming from a newspaper widely perceived as supportive of the government, this is fertile ground for more change and more negative imagery for the incumbents.
Still, there are pockets of blind loyalty to the government, and Defence Minister Brendan Nelson knows exactly where to find them. In this election year, he's handpicked just 3 journalists to join him on his travels to Iraq and Afghanistan. They're government barrackers, Herald Sun columnist Andrew Bolt, The Australian's political editor Dennis Shanahan, and the Sydney Morning Herald columnist Miranda Devine. 2, Miranda Devine and Dennis Shanahan, have just been to Iraq with the minister, and both splash with front-page stories that the war in Iraq was now going much better than you might have thought. There was this in the Sydney Morning Herald from Miranda Devine.
"We've sent Al-Qaeda into a spin," says US chief in Iraq. David Petraeus, the US military commander in Iraq, has given a preview of his forthcoming report to Congress, citing a dramatic reduction in violence in Baghdad and foreshadowing a gradual reduction in the number of troops in Iraq. He used as a benchmark of progress the number of ethno-sectarian deaths. In Baghdad, the monthly death toll has fallen by more than 2/3. In the rest of Iraq, such deaths have dropped by more than 50%.
And here's what Dennis Shanahan wrote in The Australian.
Surge working, says US general. The US troop surge in Iraq has thrown Al-Qaeda off balance and produced a dramatic reduction in sectarian killings and a drop in roadside bombings. General Petraeus told The Australian during a face-to-face interview at his Baghdad headquarters there had been a 75% reduction in religious and ethnic killings since last year.
The entire US strategy in Iraq hangs on General David Petraeus' report back to Congress this week on whether the troop surge is working. No wonder the Reuters newswire picked up on the Australian story that the surge was working wonders, and that papers like the New York Times followed that. In The Australian, Dennis Shanahan thought there'd be political implications here.
General David Petraeus' positive findings on the surge in Iraq will have ramifications for the Australian election campaign.
Well, if they do, it will be because readers believe The Australian's front page, but it was wrong, as the paper had to admit 3 days later.
Clarification. A report in The Australian on Friday, "Surge working," says US General, page 1, quoted the top US commander in Iraq, General David Petraeus, as saying there had been a 75% reduction in religious and ethnic killings since last year. This figure is for Baghdad and compares August with last December.
Last December registered the peak of civilian deaths in Iraq's civil war, a very convenient month to use for a comparison. Dennis Shanahan says,
I used the term last year, and General Petraeus' office wanted it to be precise and requested that it was printed December to August.
So what are the real figures on Iraq's latest violence?
At least 1,771 civilians were killed in Iraq in August, up 7% on the previous month, according to figures compiled by 3 Iraqi ministries and seen by AFP. August's toll is significantly higher than the number for February, when the United States launched a surge during which Baghdad and its surrounds were flooded with 28,500 extra troops.
In fact, on the very same day Australians were reading about Iraq's lessening violence from Dennis Shanahan and Miranda Devine, Associated Press published this.
Baghdad. Civilian deaths rose in August to their second highest monthly level this year. That raises questions about whether US strategy is working, days before Congress receives landmark reports that will decide the course of the war.
Washington-based reporters point out that General Petraeus has been talking up the situation in Iraq for years, despite the slide into chaos.
He always manages to paint a hopeful picture. In 2004, as a 2-star division commander. In 2005, as a 3-star training Iraqi forces.
It's great to see the determination of many of those who were such good partners when we were here.
And today, after years of setbacks and violence, the now 4-star general remains optimistic. Petraeus says there is political progress in Iraq as well, despite a series of reports that say there has been next to none.
That's the kind of analysis a journalist who knows the story can bring, and presumably why Defence Minister Nelson hasn't been travelling with expert security reporters. There were other signs that things mightn't be as positive as the General suggested. The day before Devine and Shanahan were published, a major story on Iraq, leaked to the Washington Post, was breaking across America.
Report finds little progress on Iraq goals. Iraq has failed to meet all but 3 of 18 congressionally mandated benchmarks for political and military progress. The document questions whether some aspects of a more positive assessment by the White House last month adequately reflected the range of views within the administration.
The Sydney Morning Herald did run that story, but on page 14, while Miranda Devine's story ran on the front page. It only ran on page 13 of The Australian a week later when it was officially released. And why did Shanahan and Devine miss this negative assessment on Iraq since the start of the surge that General Petraeus was giving to others?
The most senior US commander in Iraq has said that progress in bringing security to the country had been uneven and in some cases disappointing. General David Petraeus said Iraq's political leaders had not made the gains hoped for under the US troop surge strategy. It has not worked out as we hoped.
Despite not mentioning that lack of political progress, Miranda Devine says,
General Petraeus's September 7 letter to troops mirrors what he told me in his office in Baghdad and what I reported in my news story of August 31. Any tonal discordance is a product of your imagination.
Still, Miranda Devine was prepared to pit her knowledge against opposition leader Kevin Rudd's understanding of the country.
He should go to Iraq and Afghanistan and see for himself the important work our troops are doing, and judge for himself their morale.
Miranda Devine's own instant expert status was achieved in less than 48 hours in Iraq. Her elevation to visiting war correspondent has been met with scoffing derision within Fairfax. Still, from Brendan Nelson's perspective, the selection of friendly reporters to cover his final trip to Iraq before the election worked a treat. That's the show for this week. Thanks for being with us, and I'll see you next week.